On Wilting Day, the townspeople of Lotus Lake gather in the local garden and pick petals off of their favorite flowers. They whisper wishes to these petals and throw them into the wind, hoping the gods may grant their wishes. Floris, the goddess of life and creator of these gardens, has been part of the town's legacy for centuries. It is said that Floris will grant the townspeople's wishes, as long as the people take good care of her sacred gardens. Centuries ago, there lived a man who challenged Floris's power. The man traveled to the town square every day at dawn, spouting the hard truth of taking care of these gardens. "We're wasting our water and energy on gardens we didn't ask for," he would say. And the townspeople agreed. They ignored the gardens, built up fences around them with no entrances. Some townspeople broke into the gardens and picked the flowers from their roots, destroying this sacred land. As months went by, the political climate within the town grew harsh and insatiable. Some people missed the gardens and wished to bring them back, worried that Floris would cast a plague over the town. Others were relieved that the gardens would no longer take away their precious time, and ignored the wishes of the so-called flower folks. The year went by, and the gardens were forgotten. When the day came for Floris to grant the townspeople's wishes, she ascended from the heavens above and fell behind the fence that encapsulated her flowers. The townspeople tried their best to ignore the weeps and cries of the god who cared so much for the garden she built. Floris's cries engulfed the town for hours, until the man who had challenged her judgment decided to take this matter into his own filthy hands. The man hopped over the fence he helped build all those months ago, and began trudging through the dry, dead flowers below his feet. With every step, Floris's cries grew louder and louder until the man reached her. She fell silent. The man was suddenly engulfed with sympathy. He started to speak, but was immediately interrupted by the silky, echoing voice of the god he had once questioned. As Floris spoke, the man began to cry. "I built these gardens when the life on this planet had just started to come to fruition," she said. "They were a gift, a memorial of my love for the life I had created. The flowers would wilt every year and come back the next, a beautiful, never-ending cycle of life and death." She spoke softly. "I would tend to the garden every day, pulling weeds from their roots and planting them elsewhere, picking dead petals off of the flowers to keep the garden as perfect as the land I planted them on. A place for everyone to see how beautiful the world can be when it is taken care of." The goddess picked a wilting flower and began to walk closer to the man. "When your people came along, all those centuries ago, they set up a small camp by the lake near the garden and began to tend to it, just as I had. I watched for decades as your people witnessed the same cycle I did, and tended to the garden all the same, knowing that the flowers would wilt, and preparing for them to bloom once again." Floris planted the dry, dead flower at the man's feet and began to water it. She spoke again with a slightly tired tone. "My time grew short, and I could no longer check up on my garden as often as I used to. But every year, just before the flowers began to wilt, I would come to this planet to witness the colors of the flowers and the work of those I had left them with." She paused. The flower at the man's feet began to bloom. Floris showed the man a sad smile and continued her story. "The garden was always just as perfect as the year before, and your people even began to expand upon it. Eventually, I decided to thank your people for their dedication to taking care of my garden, and decided to leave it to them alone. I promised them that if they took good care of my flowers, I would grant each person within the town one wish, meeting them within the garden at dawn on this day, just before the flowers wilted, and they happily obliged. They called this day Wilting Day." Floris patted down on the loose soil around the flower and stood up to look the man in the eyes. "For centuries, this garden was perfect. Every year I came back to enjoy it, and in return I would reward your people with their promised wishes," She looked down at the flower below and whispered, "I never meant for this to become a burden." She slowly looked back up at the man and spoke, "I am sorry. Thank you for taking care of my garden. In return for this burden, I will grant you one last wish." The man's eyes grew wide with confusion. Florus awaited his answer. The two were silent. "You need not answer right now," she said. "Here." She picked a petal from the flower she planted and placed it in the man's hand. "When you are ready, whisper your wish into a flower petal and toss it into the wind. I will hear it and come to grant your wish." She closed the man's fingers around the petal, smiled, and carefully walked toward the spot she had fallen. As she reached the spot, she turned to face the man. "Thank you," she said, and turned into what looked like shimmering stardust, blowing away with the wind. The man stood there for what felt like hours. Over the next few weeks, the man woke up every day at dawn to deconstruct the fence he built with his fellow townspeople, and replanting the flowers they ripped from the earth. He apologized profusely to those who wanted to keep the sacred garden, and told the story of what happened to the town. Months went by, and by the time the flowers were ready to bloom, the garden was almost finished. In the coming weeks, the man's health began to decline, growing more and more sick by the day. He refused to stay in bed and worked on the garden every moment he could, taking breaks by Florus's spot when he could no longer stand. He had to see the garden finished, and eventually, he did. The flowers began to bloom, creating waves of color across the patch of land he tended. The man's final day came. Knowing that his time was growing short, he picked a petal from his favorite flower and took his final seat by Florus's spot. He held the flower softly in his hand and whispered his final words into the petal. The man softly tossed the petal into the wind, laid down next to the goddess's spot, and passed on. A woman from the town found the man's body and alerted the town of the news. The townspeople decided to bury him in the garden, in the spot that he passed, and marked his grave with the title of the groundskeeper. Today, the grave is well maintained and visited by the townspeople often. Florus's spot was marked with a small shrine, where the people in the town leave gifts for the goddess. Florus has not shown up for Wilting Day in centuries, but some people say you can see her standing at the man's grave on the anniversary of his death, and leaving him flowers in the night. The townspeople say that they celebrate Wilting Day in the hopes that Florus will come back to her garden and witness the colors once again, hoping that she can hear the words of the town and know that her garden is being taken care of. People come from around the world to make their wishes to the goddess and to catch a glimpse of the never-ending beauty of her garden. If you can hear them, Florus, thank you for your gift to the world.